Hello and welcome to the Beyond Biotech podcast number 119. I'm Jim Cornell and this is the weekly podcast from Labiotech. Today we're taking a look under the hood, so to speak, at the Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute, otherwise known as Gates MRI. It's a non-profit medical research organisation dedicated to the development and effective use of products like drugs, vaccines and monoclonal antibodies to address substantial global health concerns. Usually those are concerns where investment incentives are limited, and those health concerns include malaria, tuberculosis, diarrheal diseases, and diseases that impact maternal, newborn, and child health. And so our guest on the show today is Dr. Claire Wagner, Head of Corporate Strategy and Market Access at Gates MRI. She has dedicated her life to global health. She started out working in Africa, which led to her becoming one of the early employees at Gates MRI. She tackles the challenges of paving the way for drugs, biologics and vaccines that Gates MRI is developing. And if they are successful in clinical trials, the goal is to deliver affordable and accessible treatments to the people in low and middle income countries who would benefit the most. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Wagner today. So I thought maybe it would be interesting, considering the background that you've had and how interesting that is, maybe you could kind of go into a bit of detail about your previous work in the health field and what brought you to Gates MRI.
Sure, Jim. Thanks for welcoming me to your podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity. Always appreciate the opportunity to share more about the work that we have the privilege of doing here at Gates MRI. And where we are today in our organization is, and maybe I'll just frame it up a little bit for the audience. We're almost 7 years old now as an organization, and we've grown considerably in not just people, but in what our portfolio looks like and the capabilities that we have internally and with our collaborating partners to do the work that we've been set out to do as an organization at this intersection of big global health problems, major disease burdens, under-addressed disease burdens around the world, and limited commercial opportunity or commercial incentive. And that intersection is really where we see our kind of value proposition in the ecosystem and not exclusive of other partners. That's actually through partnerships is how we do the work that we do. And for me personally, to your question, earlier in my career, much of the work that I was doing was further downstream, just about as downstream as it gets, actually, in product introduction and rolling out the actual pharmaceutical product or diagnostic product or new equipment in a community setting where I was working, which was in Rwanda for the Ministry of Health. And that type of product introduction work is really what ultimately led me to this place where I'm now almost as upstream as it gets. Any further upstream, I'd be on the investing side of the operation. And that arc also included work that I got to do with the World Health Organization, for example, on the essential medicines list, and with different academic medical centers in the US to advance human resource capacity and health system strengthening in under-resourced settings. So having had that downstream now to upstream experience, it is also a real privilege for me personally to be able to apply those experiences and those skills to the big problems that we're trying to solve here at Gates MRI for our products, and thinking about how do we future-proof access considerations for products that are in development now? What kind of partnerships do we need to stand up? And what does our stakeholder landscape look like in order to ensure that we are well prepared for future rollout of products that are successfully developed in our portfolio?
What took you to Rwanda in the first place?
Actually, in the Boston area, I find many roads lead to Rwanda. I was on one of those roads and fortunate for that experience. But there are a lot of collaborations between the academic medical world here in Boston, in the Boston area, and incredible public health and health system strengthening work being led by the Ministry of Health of Rwanda. So what took me there specifically was there are a lot of different attributions. One of the core attributions there was the mentors that I had at the time, who are still mentors and colleagues of mine today. And I had the opportunity to work with two of the co-founders of an organization called Partners in Health, one being Jim Kim and the other being Paul Farmer, as well as faculty at Dartmouth, including Lisa Adams and Sienna Craig. And through the quadruple threat of those mentors, I was introduced to one of the leaders in the Rwandan public health sector, Dr. Agnes Benagwaho, who was permanent secretary in the Ministry of Health at the time, and was looking for a research assistant, actually, initially. And I thought there could be no better job on planet Earth for me than that job. And I applied for it and interviewed for it, and just like, a regular job. And before I knew it, I was flying over to Kigali, where I was meant to stay for less than a year, and ended up staying for 3 years and a couple of years on and off after that, and still have very close relationships with all of my colleagues there, which I'm very grateful for.
Now you're at Gates MRI. What led to that? And could you explain your role there?
The organization has evolved, and I think with that, as in any quote unquote startup environment, the earlier you join an organization, often the more hats you wear as the organization evolves. And I've been fortunate to wear a few different hats while I've been here. Initially as chief of staff, and I will attribute that introduction to Paul Farmer, who was the one who pointed me towards the Gates MRI, actually, about 5 years ago. And he had given a talk here to the staff in their early years of opening up shop. And so as our business needs have evolved in recent years, we got to a place where our portfolio is advanced to a stage where we now have a very large phase 3 program ongoing. We have a few assets in later stage clinical development in phase 2. And our vantage point now, or became over time, that the need to embed access planning and strategic planning for future product introduction, even though we will not be the ultimate name on the label taking this product to the market, that we actually have a very significant responsibility to ensure that that future commercial partner is set up for success. And a lot of that work has to take place very early on, as I'm sure you know. So, T minus 5 to 10 years, even at the start of your product planning, thinking downstream to how this will look in practice for the user, with the clinicians providing whatever type of care is involved in your product introduction, thinking really far ahead to what that eventuality could look like is critical from, I would argue, the earliest stages of development. And it looks different at different phases of development, but certainly it was critical for us with our TB vaccine in such late stage to stand up what our market access planning would look like. And I was fortunate to be able to step into that role for the organization.
You mentioned that it's been around for 7 years. It's obviously, there's so much going on there, so it's clearly quite challenging. I wonder if you could maybe highlight some of the positive outcomes that you've been able to achieve in those 7 years.
If we look at the organization as a whole, as the corporation, so to speak, and understand our outcomes as those that involve our portfolio, so building out our portfolio, advancing assets through the pipeline of development, those are all very tangible, quantifiable outcomes that I think we've been able to excel at. I'll name a couple of those, are sort of interim achievements in that space. The phase 3 clinical trial for our M72 AS01 vaccine is enrolling now in several countries across Africa and Asia. This is a very large trial. It's a 20,000 participant study building on a phase 2B study published in the New England Journal that showed that this particular asset has a 50 to 68% efficacy in reducing the conversion from latent to active pulmonary tuberculosis disease. And the variation depends on how you slice the data, 1 sputum sample or 2 sputum samples. That achievement in and of itself, I think, says a lot about how far we've come to be so far into the rollout of that clinical study, even with the years ahead of reaching our endpoint, which we anticipate will take a few years. I think says a lot about our organization and really building the operations from the ground up over the last 6-7 years. There's other ways to look at our achievements. One of those is in our staffing in general, our organization in general, and how we've grown very efficiently. We maintain a pretty lean staff, and one of our goals is to really maximize on our ability to collaborate with partners. That's seen through our pan-TB program, which is a program that's designed to look at novel regimens for the treatment of TB in partnership with commercial entities like Otsuka, as well as nonprofit entities like the TB Alliance in New York. And so we see ourselves as a leader in that work alongside other leading organizations and our collaborators to effectively get that work done. So I think there's a lot of different ways to look at achievement as an organization, but I certainly think we have a lot to be proud of and a long road ahead, right? We have a lot of good work to continue to be doing. Now, in our market access space in particular, one of the areas that, just to highlight also, is there are no magic bullets or no single solution, no single party solutions to achieving equitable access. History is full of examples of successful access programs and also less successful access programs, but any of them will involve multiple parties at the table because all of this work is done in concert with public sector entities, private sector entities, often philanthropies, often development finance institutions. And so one of the things that we've really focused on over the last couple of years is to look at what those partnerships should be for example, our TB vaccine, and start to stand up those partnerships and think about how to ensure, like we discussed earlier, that time point zero where the product is registered and ready to go to market, should the clinical study repeat the phase 2B, that we have the right architecture that has already been stood up to do that work.
What would you say the R&D priorities are?
As an organization overall, initially when we were founded, we were really focused on the earlier stages of development, on translational medicine and discovery work. And as our portfolio grew and expanded and the trials moved ahead in time and space, we had to build capabilities in later stage development work. And I think that is a two-way street. It's a sort of a bi-directional thing, right? That we also have now evolved as our assets have evolved as an organization. What we're most focused on now from an R&D perspective is, as I mentioned, our TB vaccine program, our TB drugs program, as well as several assets we're exploring in the malaria space. We are looking at our R&D portfolio in the same light as how when we were founded, that we should be an organization that can solve under-addressed global public health problems that may not be able to be addressed by other types of organizations or commercial entities. And that's where we should most effectively spend our resources and time and energy.
I guess traditional biotech and biopharma companies are working towards similar goals in some respects, looking to treat diseases, and you're doing the same thing. How does what you're doing there differ from traditional biotech and biopharma companies?
A great question, Jim. I would wager to say it varies very little in terms of actual operational work that's being done. If you look under the hood at our organization, we're structured like a pharmaceutical company is structured, more or less. I'll get to some of the less in a moment. The duration of experience that staff have prior to joining the Gates MRI is roughly 15 to 20 years in industry. So we're recruiting from industry. We have industry practices in our organization. We operate like a pharmaceutical company would, with collaborating partners around the world. Where we differ is, for example, being a nonprofit and not being the entity that will take our product to market. We will partner with commercial partners for our assets who will then take the product to market. So internally, how that looks is that we wouldn't necessarily have a sales and marketing team, right? So we don't have a sales and marketing team. We are not looking for a return on investment for our shareholders. The kind of return that we look for is in public health impact. That is what our stakeholders, our funders, the Gates Foundation, as well as Wellcome, are looking for. And that is so that we can work towards the vision of our funders and of our CEO and of our organization's mission. And those are some of the ways that we do differ. However, I think any industry veteran would spend a day with us and see that most of our practices are basically undifferentiable from what you'd see upstairs or downstairs here at One Candle Square. And I think that makes it a really interesting place to be, frankly, from an employee perspective, at least, to be able to work on these issues of major global health burden, but not have the same kind of commercial constraints that are often characteristic of being, for example, a biotech of this size.
Absolutely. How does that extend to partnerships? I mean, how do you develop and maintain and administer some of the partnerships that you have to form when you're doing the things that you do?
There's a lot of types of partners that we work with, as any pharmaceutical organization does. The CROs that we work with are clinical trial partners in the countries where the trials are being conducted, investigators and so forth. There are funding partners. There are our collaborating partners, such as on the pan-TB program. And maybe I'll just give you some examples from my own space, the kind of collaborations that we have with key stakeholders who have a major role in the future access paradigm for our products. And those are some of the organizations like the Gavi Alliance, the Global Fund for TB, HIV, and Malaria, certainly the World Health Organization. Maybe just to take some of those examples and illustrate that where we see our ability to set a future commercial entity up for success in product introduction likely will rely heavily on some of the decisions that get made in Geneva, for example. And so just like our partners at GSK or any other pharmaceutical company might do, establishing those linkages early to understand the priorities of WHO, of Gavi, of the Global Fund, of similar organizations is a critical piece of our work. And I think in addition to the essential partnerships that will need to be had between entities on the development side and manufacturing and production side with government partners. And from my own experience in Rwanda, I can't stress enough the importance of effective partnerships from the government side, because ultimately that's the gate to being able to reach populations and people who would need the products that we're developing. So really effective public-private partnerships I see as essential to that work.
I know that we do lots of interviews on treatments and treatment options, and a lot of those are at the extremely expensive end of the scale. But it seems that even inexpensive treatments can be quite unequal in that they're often rolled out initially in the US and Western Europe and sometimes Japan. The inequality between developed and developing countries, what kind of challenges do you see and how can some of those be addressed?
You're speaking my language, Jim. So there are a few studies that have come out recently, and I'll just highlight a couple of statistics from those. There's many we could look at, but one is, I hope I'm getting this right, but the average time between a product being introduced in high-income countries versus low-income countries is between 7 and 10 years on average. That's a long time from registration. I think we've seen in recent years, too, some unfortunate delays in access to products that have been designed for use in low-income countries based on disease burden and approved for use and not rolled out as quickly as they might have been. The second statistic I'll raise is from a recent study by IQVIA And I can't remember the exact figure, but it was something around 90%. So in a recent 5-year period, 2018 to 2023, total gross sales of pharmaceutical products in the US and EU5, the top 5 EU countries, amounted for greater than 90% of total revenue. So if you're looking at the rest of the world minus 6 countries, and looking at only less than 10% of potential revenue, and now I'm doing it on a gross basis, which is a little bit too simplistic, but just to illustrate the point that that economic basis is a challenging one if you're a commercial entity. I mean, I think that becomes very challenging. So how do you effectively get products to people who need them in a timely way? There's a lot of different tools out there that have been deployed to engender competitiveness in health equity and access. One of those is the Access to Medicines Index, which I believe is coming out at the end of this year. And that helped to identify some of the metrics that can be used to evaluate how certain industry entities do compared to one another. There are a lot of different types of access paradigms that can be looked at as a kind of benchmark or scaffolding upon which to build an access strategy. But I think, in my personal view, one of the things that's really missing is a community of practice around global health access, a science of understanding market access. And that, to me, is one of the opportunities we have, and I include myself in that, the opportunities we have in this space to really level up the access and equity ecosystem as a whole, because it's not a mystery and it's not really rocket science getting a product to the marketplace, but it does require a highly integrated, longitudinal set of partnerships, relationships, resources, and focus that can be complicated by the external environment. And I think, this is an area that I find really interesting. And it's also an area that's very dynamic right now. There's a lot of discussion about different novel market shaping tools and development finance organizations playing a more central role in access paradigms. So that's an area that I'd really be keen to see evolve and would keen to be part of that evolution.
Is there also potentially the issue of the fact that many companies are driven by profit, and so some of the diseases and conditions that might be prevalent in some of the lower income countries aren't necessarily revenue generating like some of the gene therapy treatments?
Sure. I mean, there's no denying that part of the inequities is certainly because of the potential return on some of the investments. And these are not small investments. Our phase 3 study for TB read about it in the press release. The number of zeros in that is quite staggering. These are not small investments. These are major funding agreements. And it's not easy for a commercial entity to take that on. These are not small things. But I think, just to look back, the only tuberculosis vaccine that's on the market currently was developed over 100 years ago, the BCG vaccine. It's given in infancy, childhood. It's for largely for prevention of pediatric disease. If you were to phone up the scientists 102 years ago who developed that vaccine and told them about all the advances in chat GPT and stem cell therapy and gene therapy and the amazing things we can do now in science, and then tell them that we're still giving your vaccine and we haven't developed another one, I think that would be pretty shocking. But it goes to show that some of these big intractable problems do require a very significant amount of momentum, resources, time, and partnership to get done. And this vaccine that we're working on has been in development for over 20 years. History did not just start on the M72 AS01 vaccine. This is something that's been in development for a long time. And we have the privilege of now hopefully getting it over the finish line. and ultimately with our partners out into the marketplace. But these are big investments, and I think do go to show the need for multiple types of approaches to development work, particularly in the global health space. And as my old boss, Paul Farmer, would say, we live in one world, not three. And I think there's nothing like an infectious disease to make that very clear to the world about, addressing diseases of different parts of the world. I think we've all been given a solid dose of what that reality is, and the need to find approaches that are commensurate with the global burden of disease.
Do you think that's maybe not that it was a good thing that happened with COVID, but do you think that that's potentially a silver lining to that cloud? Is that the realization that what happens in one place can very quickly happen everywhere?
Yeah, I think we'll all look back on this, and hopefully we'll do more looking back than looking at the present. Not to say it's fully in our rear view mirror, though, but we'll all look on that as having really changed so much about how we do business, how we think about the world, how we operate. And I do think that there are ways that experience really accelerated some of the energy that was already moving in some of these directions. So it's not to say that the royal we didn't think about some of these issues, but certainly COVID threw into stark relief some of the realities. And we've seen a catapulting into this new global health era. And a lot of the issues that were not necessarily front and center are now front and center. One of those being regionalization of manufacturing, for example. And that certainly is one of the more central topics in the global health ecosystem right now.
You have kind of 5 program areas that you're tackling. Are there other organizations or companies developing treatments within those areas that you're working on?
There are. All of these disease areas have overlaps with other organizations and other companies. And in fact, I think that's one of the real advantages of being the Gates MRI in this space, is that we get to work with those entities, whether they're commercial or nonprofit or academic. I think our versatility in being able to work across multiple types of partners is part of what makes us able to add real value in the ecosystem across the different disease areas.
You have quite a few assets in some of your programs. I wonder if you could give us a bit of an overview of the 9 assets that you have and some of the clinical trials that you're undertaking.
Sure. So what we're most known for, I should say, is our TB vaccine, which we spent some time talking about here. And I think that is for a few different reasons. One being the large partnership that has been set up between us and our funder and our commercial partner, GSK. Other being the momentousness of having a novel TB vaccine in the pipeline this far along. And there are other products, which is good. We want other TB vaccine products. We want competition. The more competition for these global health products, the better, in my view. The other reason that this program is so front and center, I think, is the potential impact if the product is rolled out successfully. If the clinical trial checks out and if the product gets rolled out, the modeling has shown just a massive public health impact and macroeconomic impact, saving trillions of dollars in global GDP if this product reaches the intended people and populations. The other program that we spoke about a bit already is the clinical studies for finding a new regimen for tuberculosis treatment. So the idea is to reduce the time, burden on the patient, toxicity, and other key characteristics that really warrant improvement on current regimens. And we have the great fortune of having an incredible set of partners on the PAN-TB program, including Evotech, GSK, Janssen, as well as the TB Alliance and the Gates Foundation. So again, I think this is a really great illustration of our ability to convene public, private, commercial, philanthropic entities together and expedite the development of a novel PAN-TB regimen that can be used for treating nearly all TB patients in our target product profile, really enabling a simpler test and treat paradigm. We ourselves are responsible for the execution of the phase 2B and phase 2C clinical trials. And we see that partnership as being really critical to advancing the field overall in TB therapeutics. As far as our other portfolio programs, we work in close collaboration with the Gates Foundation, of course. And so as a subsidiary of the Gates Foundation, not only does that have certain implications for how we operate as an organization and how we work closely with the Gates Foundation, but also it means that we are involved in areas that are priority of the foundation. And the focus has been on addressing disease burden broadly in low-income settings by the foundation, but also specific to HIV, TB, malaria, maternal newborn child health, diarrheal diseases. And we have ourselves been involved in several efforts to advance some of the work across the foundation's areas of priority, including maternal newborn and child health and diarrheal diseases. And the work ongoing for us in those domains outside of TB and malaria are really subject to some of the ongoing discussions with our sponsors. And we see as our ability to contribute effectively in this space will be in concert with the Gates Foundation.
We've already talked a bit about the TB work that you're doing, but I wonder if we could kind of drill down into a little bit of the science behind that, maybe why it's necessary. You mentioned the old drug that's been around for 100 years, why a new one is necessary and how the drug works.
Sure. So the status quo for preventing conversion to active pulmonary TB, and I'm not a TB doctor, so you're getting my version of this, Jim. But the status quo of preventing conversion to active pulmonary TB is TB preventative treatment, which can be very cumbersome for patients, involving dozens to hundreds of pills. I think we actually, 140 to 252 pills to take just for prevention of conversion to active disease. Also requires pre-screening. And the actual efficacy of TPT is limited in high burden settings. So you're not even looking at 100% efficacy in some of the settings where this would be rolled out. TB is a disease that's really hard to control. Obviously, there's a lot of basis for looking at the environmental considerations of where hotspots are for TB in urban areas and crowded areas. The diagnostic process for TB is complex, involving sputum collection. Long courses of treatment and preventative therapy mean that, just like any of us, anything done longitudinally, there's a higher risk of not completing, right? And we see that everywhere in the world, having nothing to do with certain places, but certainly in countries that have weaker elements of their health system, that becomes a bigger problem. And I think the world has really gotten behind this idea that the status quo is not good enough. I mean, it sort of sounds obvious to say, but it's true that the cost of inaction is far too high. For example, if we do nothing, if there's no TB vaccine, if there's no new TB vaccine, and we continue as we are doing now with TB preventive therapy, with the current rates of efficacy and so forth, a study in the Lancet Global Health in 2022 showed that the economic losses that are estimated to occur by 2050, between 2025 and 2050, with no change to the status quo, are 17.5 trillion US dollars. No matter how you slice the data, whether you're looking at macroeconomic losses, whether you're looking at burden to TB patients, whether you're just looking at the science of it, I think there's no question that the status quo is not good enough and that there's a need for a novel TB vaccine, novel TB products to address the burden of disease.
How does the new treatment that you're developing actually work?
So the actual vaccine for the M72AS01 vaccine is a recombinant fusion protein, and it's combined with an adjuvant that is the GSK proprietary adjuvant called AS01, and it is administered together. And the phase 2b trial showed that with the administration of the M72AS01 product 1 month apart, 2 doses 1 month apart, that you could reduce conversion to active pulmonary TB by 50 to 70%, 68%.
Is it something that would need to be, you'd need boosters at given intervals, or is it just those two?
It's a great question, Jim. There's a lot of follow-on questions and studies that will need to be done. In the category of future studies for a vaccine like this, there are many, including certain vulnerable populations, pregnant women. There's a lot of work that remains to be done, including the role of boosters.
You already have, I guess, a full plate just with the TB and then all of the other things that you're working on as well. But do you anticipate in the future adding to the program areas or the pipeline, given that the needs are so high? I mean, it must be difficult to reconcile all of the need with what you're able to do.
You bring up a great point. I think that's absolutely right. There's no shortage of good work to be done in this space. And I do think that working really thoughtfully and carefully at that intersection where we can add value is what we have to do. And yet it's hard because I spent much of my earlier part of my career in the global oncology space and burden of cancer in low-income countries. And there's huge need for novel therapeutics in the cancer space and addressing the burden of cancer in low-income countries. So I do think that you're absolutely right to hit on the point that there is no end of good work to be done in product development in the quote unquote global health arena. What we get to do is to work very closely with our colleagues at the Gates Foundation to understand the priorities at the foundation and really work to implement the vision and mission of the foundation and our funders broadly in the priority areas of our funders.
Some amazing work that the Gates MRI does, and it's fantastic to see just how dedicated the team there is to helping people around the world. Don't forget to check out the latest news and articles over at Labiotech.eu, and I hope wherever in the world you are, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.